Well, I'm looking at it's actually intriguing to follow the last discussion because we're talking quite a bit there about how does one handle bank failure when the crisis is systemic rather than episodic. And I've got a similar focus here. What's the role of law going to be when you have systemic crises rather than just the episodic stuff that I think the law's designed to handle? And to move on to the next slide, if my computer will actually move. That I didn't want to have happen. Great start. Okay, right. So my starting point is to argue that the conventional theory supports the current legal approach to contract law as regards credit. There's only one problem with that, of course, and that's the conventional theory is based on a set of myths. So you have law itself, which is also based on enforcing a set of myths. And one of those myths is that money is like a commodity. If you look at the way in which money is treated in conventional economic theory, it's actually very well satirized by Michael Kumhoff, who is a conventional but very highly skilled conventional economic modeler, but quite aware of the role of banks. And he says, really, if you look at how it's analysed in conventional theory, it's as if people come up to a bank with a load of gravel, pour the gravel in, and somebody else comes out and borrows the gravel later. He has a wonderful satirical article, component and paper on the IMF making precisely that analogy. I highly recommend it. In that case, of course, if you lend, in Michael's case, gravel, in my case, I'm using a car, and somebody that doesn't pay you for the miles they do, or doesn't return the car at the end of the period, you as the lender have lost something. You've been disadvantaged by not having the car in the meantime. You've lost by not being paid for its use while it's being used. Second myth is that the debt contract only affects the direct parties to the contract. You don't need to consider, except in exceptional circumstances, what is the impact of this contract on third parties who aren't signatories to the contract itself. And that, in the way that conventional economists describe it, is to say that private debt, and this is a quote from Bernake, has no significant macroeconomic effects. The distribution of debt may matter, the actual magnitude does not. And finally, of course, we know economic crises can't occur. Can they? Well, so realistic economics opposes all of those. Money's a non-commodity, and it's often produced in excess, and the banks are the producers of that non-commodity. It has macroeconomic effects, which affects non-parties in a dramatic way, probably more so than virtually any other factor I could think of except carbon dioxide. And systemic crises are endemic to capitalism. So that's the framework I want to put forward now. And of course, the danger of systemic crisis is our legal system is not set up to handle systemic events. It's set up to handle episodic events where someone in a mass of people does something wrong. We have a legal system that handles theft, that doesn't handle invasion. So we need a systemic approach on debt defaults during economic crisis, like the one we've been through so far. And if we impose the episodic bias that normally when somebody defaults, it's the fault of the debtor, if you enforce that absolutely, you'd be enforcing an absolute economic collapse, which is hardly what law is intended to do. So I'm going to conclude by arguing that law needs to develop in some capacity, and I don't think it'd be done through the normal court system, some capacity to adjust debt contracts when you're in a systemic crisis, which is not the sort of thing judges are used to doing, nor lawyers to arguing for. So the conventional commodity vision of money, let's start there. This is a quote from my favourite conventional economist, Paul Krugman. And he makes a case there, trying to explain his position on how the depression could be ended instantly, back in his book, End This Depression Now, is to think of it this way: when debt is rising, it's not the economy as a whole borrowing more money. I'm going to argue completely reject that, but let's start from his position. It's not the economy as a whole borrowing more money, it's simply less patient people borrowing from more patient people. And then here when you have Bernake saying that debt deflation, which is Irving Fisher's argument about what caused the Great Depression, was less influential in academic circles because of the counter-argument to this debt deflation proposition, that debt deflation was no more than a redistribution from one group, debtors, to another group, creditors. I hope in a room full of lawyers, I don't need to point at a slight flaw in the logic there, that normally what happens in a debt deflation is the debtors don't pay their debts. So there ain't anything being redistributed, but nonetheless that's the perspective that Bernake starts from, and then says, without implausibly large differences in the marginal propensities to spend of those two groups, pure redistribution should have no significant macroeconomic effects. And if there is no significant macroeconomic impact, then of course there's no deleterious impact on a third party from a debt contract. It just affects the two individuals the bank and the borrower, it doesn't affect the rest of society. So you can ignore it, and therefore current legal practice is okay. Now, the difficulty in tying down what the conventional vision of banks, debt and money is that there is no conventional vision of banks, debt and money. They simply don't exist in most economic models. I've since told that since the financial crisis, almost every conference now is with a person building a dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model trying to incorporate banks, debt and money in there somehow. Normally one or two of the above three. I think anybody's tried to do the whole three so far. But before the crisis, they completely ignored them. I got a very nice little tweet from Noah Smith, who runs the Noah Opinion blog, at one point when I made a comment about did these papers occur with all these banks, debt, DSG models, including banks, did they happen before the crisis or after? He said after crisis. Of course, there's no point in predicting it before it happens. Very nicely put, I thought. Now here's back to my favourite economist again, self-proclaimed true Minskyites, and put myself and Randy in that basket, view banks as institutions that are somehow outside the rules that apply to the rest of the economy, having unique powers for good or evil. Said he doesn't see it that way. Said so he and many other economists think, and he's right about that. The vast majority of economists, certainly more so prior to the crisis than after, thought banks aren't particularly important. They're an important financial intermediary, but no more so important than any other type of financial intermediary, or indeed any other buyer or spender. Banks don't create the money out of thin air any more than anyone does by choosing to spend more. And banks are just one channel linking lenders to borrowers. And he says he'll get the usual barrage of claims that he doesn't know what he's talking about, but he reckons it's the mystics who don't know who are wrong. Now, the mystics, and myself and Randy both got involved in this debate when it happened back in 2012, I think, wasn't it? Yeah. This title was called Banking Mysticism. Now, my perspective is that conventional economic theory is actually inhabited by barter mystics who believe you can analyse capitalism without banks, debt and money. Well, good luck. You might be getting a nice description of a New Guinea village, but you're not describing modern capitalism. But I want to show why. One thing I will say in favour of this model, the conventional view, if it is correct, then they are drawing the correct logical intuition from it. And I want to show that to you. If they were right, that their vision of what lending is and what the role of banks is in lending is correct, they would be logically correct as well that there is no significant macroeconomic impact. I want to illustrate that. And what I'm going to do that is one of the few papers that's been published that includes banks and debt, but not money, strangely enough. Banks and debt in it is a supplement to Eggleston and Krugman's paper on what they call the Minsky-Koo-Fisher paper. And in that supplement, there's a model that has a bank. And what this bank does, but in the initial paper, they have a patient agent lending to an impatient agent. It's all about consuming existing commodities. Here they've brought in the existence of a consumption sector making consumer goods, an investment sector making investment goods. They do the usual thing of shoving workers and capitalists together into representative agents. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to have separate workers and capitalists. Last time I checked, I didn't have much in the way of profit coming into my income statement. So what you have is in this model, they had the banks storing the deposits for the agents. Here I'm going to have a post-Keynesian approach and talk about sectors instead. And the bank in their model arranges a loan between the consumer sector and the investment sector, and then it charges a fee for the service of arranging that loan. And this is looking at it from the balance sheet point of view. Now, one thing you're going to find strange about this is my Minsky software of showing a table called a Godley table in honour of Wynne Godley from inside the model. And in this paper, in the program itself, assets are shown as positives and liabilities and equity are shown as negatives. And across every row, everything has to balance to zero. So I've got a plus and a minus at all times. And the flow, think about the theory you have, where engineers model electrical flow. They have it going from plus to minus. Now we know it's negative electrons going the opposite direction, but plus to minus is the convention there. That works here too, and I'll show you why in a moment. But there's lending. Okay, the consumer agent is lending to the investing agent. And from the bank's point of view, the bank's liability to the consuming agent has declined because there's less money in the deposit account of the consuming agent. Their liability to the investment sector has increased because there's more money there, so the larger negative from the point of view of the bank. And notice debt doesn't appear there. That's because debt is not an asset or a liability of the banking sector. It's an asset of the consumer sector and a liability investing sector. So here's the same system from the point of view of the consumer agent now. And you notice now that what's happening by lending the money is that the asset has declined by the amount of the loan, but they've got a matching increase in the asset of the loan, which is D for debt. So that's the logic of having the negative and positives the way they're shown in the banking table. It makes sense when you see it from the point of view of the other agent. So that's what's going on. And of course, to lend the money, the consumer sector has to have less money. It's got to hand over some of its existing money to the investment sector, which means the consuming sector can spend less, the investing sector can spend more. So this is clearly the vision that says that when you lend money, you're doing without something. Okay? And that, of course, I think affects the mindset that lawyers have about what do you do when somebody breaches a legal contract. Well, once you put the model together, and this is now showing that's a screenshot from my simulation program Minsky, but I'll bring that up if I can find the right one here, okay, and run the model for you. So it has a banking sector here, a consumer sector. Behind each of these, by the way, is a table just like the one I've shown you a moment ago, which shows the double entry bookkeeping of the flow of money passing around the system. And over here I've got controls that control how fast lending occurs and how fast repayment of debt occurs. But if I simulate the model, you'll notice the red line there is the level of money in the economy, absolutely flatlining. Here's the level of debt as lending goes on over time, up to about 10 years worth of lending so far. And if I now say, let's have the lending occurring much more rapidly, so rather than taking every 7 years to double loans as every 5, notice the debt ratio is rising there. I've got the debt ratios shown down on the bottom screen here, but it's a bit off the screen. You can see the ratio there yourselves, the rising level of debt compared to the money supply. And if repayment slows down drastically as well, then we get an ever-increasing level of debt there, so you can have more debt than there is money in the economy. But notice GDP. It's been bouncing along at about 200 for the last 50 years of the simulation time shown up on the screen here, quite small. But I can get variations if I vary the rate of lending, so you now get much faster repayment, then the level of lending, outstanding loans plunge. Equally, if lending happens more slowly, down it goes. And you can see that by making those changes over here, I'm having a bit of an impact on GDP. Okay, there is ways in redistributing the money does have a minor impact, but that's coming back to Bernake's point. It's pretty minor. You can ignore it. It's a second order, even third order effect. So that's their vision. And if they're right about the nature of lending, then you can ignore debt in macroeconomics and you can forget about spillover effects for individual agents. But I'm going to say something really radical here. Maybe the banks are actually the lenders. What do you reckon? Well, let's find out. I'm going to go inside the consumer sector model. I'm doing this live, by the way, and for the first time I've done it live. There's one little rule of computer demonstrations, never do them live, but I'll take a risk and see what happens here. I've got the loan shown there as an asset of the consumer sector. It's actually an asset of the bank. So I'm going to delete it from that column. And now I'm going to get rid of the lending and repayment. I'm pressing the plus key, pardon me, so I shouldn't do these things live. Okay, so I'm getting rid of the lending, getting rid of the debt repayment, getting rid of interest payments, and there's no bank fee. But there's no intermediation happens, but it's a minor aspect of the financial system. So I've got rid of that there. And then the banking sector, well, it's actually an asset of the banking sector. So if I hit the plus key here, I can now click on this drop down and say, what are the unallocated assets in the system right now? Includes debt. So now the lending and the repayment are now transferred across to the bank's system. There is no bank fee, so we delete that. And to balance the system, all I need to do is add in to say the interest is paid not to the consumer sector, but back to the banking sector into its equity account. That's now balanced. Once it recognises I've made that move, good. And down here, I'm going to say lending is actually not based on the amount of money in the consumer deposits account, but it's about on the current level of outstanding debt. Just that one simple change. I could leave it the other way, by the way. It makes a bit of difference, but not a lot. Having done that, let's now see what happens when I run the model. And I'm praying, and God, you know, let's see. Oh yeah, it's not long enough for a sec. You just see now, it's running more slowly after the change, but it's still a beta piece of software. You'll notice the level of debt money is rising. That wasn't happening before. And if I now have an increase in the rate of lending and a repayment taking longer, there's an increase in the amount of money and there's a boom going on over here in GDP. And then if we have, for some reason, I can't force it, I'll force it later, let's say people want to repay their money more rapidly and lending slows down. GDP collapses. If you go back to normality again, or relative normality, no such thing as normal in capitalism, but you go back to a rising economy once more. That's the difference. When you include the fact that banks create money that adds additional demand to the economy, and the economic activity is debt-driven. And the ups and downs of what the financial sector does definitely affect the real economy. All those macroeconomic effects that the mainstream economists ignore are there. That's all it takes. Just that sort of recognition. It's not predominantly non-bank individuals lending to other non-bank individuals. It's predominantly banks lending to non-banks, and that's why banks, debt, and money matter in macroeconomics. And if you're modelling the economy without banks, debt, and money, you're not modelling capitalism. So the correct view of money, coming back to that commodity thing again, it's not a commodity. It's produced, definitely, but it's a social entity, not a commodity in that sense. And many consequences flow from that. Obviously, there are significant impacts upon third parties. A change in somebody's rate of borrowing affects you, whether you know they're borrowing or not. And it can affect us quite drastically during a financial crisis. Banks also aren't going, there's no sacrifice for a bank in lending money to somebody. They're creating something new, ab initio. And by doing that, they're not foregoing anything. In fact, they're getting a gain because that increased level of debt in the economy, as someone said in the earlier discussion, gives them more income. There's no sacrifice involved for them lending money. And there's also, in an essential way, the production cost of money is zero. Not quite zero, okay? But I've got a little illustration, which I don't know how many of you know about this. It's one that I found quite amusing. And that was the story of a New Zealand petrol station owner. Does the fact that I'm talking about a New Zealand petrol station mean anything to anybody in this room? Okay. This guy applied for a $100,000 overdraft from Westpac about 2 or 3 years ago. And they approved the overdraft. He checked his account in the morning and found he had $10 million. Now, how many of you worked in a bank before? Okay. You know that the keyboards have got that 00? Okay. What happened was, obviously, the clerk didn't press the decimal point hard enough. Okay. So what happened was, he asked for $100,000 deposit. The bank doesn't press the decimal point. So one less keystroke there, 100 times as much money created. Less effort, 100 times as much output. Now, wouldn't a real factory want that productive capacity? So it is not a commodity. It is not controlled in any sense by the cost type of measures that conventional economists get wrong about how capitalism itself is controlled. But those issues aren't even there. So we have to treat it very, very differently to how we treat loans, to treat normal commodities and what goes wrong in dealings between people and commodities itself. Of course, here to Hyman Minsky. And his perspective is what informed so much of my work and Randy's and the whole post-Keynesian community. And he said, if you look at the Chicago view, and this is again the neoclassical view, there's a financial system which would make disturbances impossible. And of course, it's the task of monetary policy to work out what it is, and also, of course, from a legal point of view, the legal society to enforce that system. I'm saying, of course, you are enforcing it, and it doesn't exist, which is partly the problems we're having in capitalism today. His alternative view, which he called under-reconstructed Keynesianism, is the capitalism inherently flawed, being prone to booms, crises, and depressions. But this is a very important phrase here. This instability is due to characteristics the financial system must possess if it is to be consistent with full-blown capitalism. Otherwise, you can't get rid of them. Now, to some extent, Ben, this is something that you need to consider, I think, in positive money, okay? Because there's an argument being made here that trying to do what you're trying to do is trying to do something capitalism can't do. So we need to discuss that one. They said if that's the system we're actually in, will generate signals that give you accelerating investment and the financing for that accelerating investment as well. Now, Minsky, I think that if anybody hasn't read Minsky, the book I would overwhelmingly recommend to read is his book of essays called Can It Happen Again? I think a very beautiful, succinct statements of his hypothesis. The second book I'd recommend is John Maynard Keynes, which is not a biography. And the third book I'd recommend to read when you need a bit of a nightcap is Stabilising an Unstable Economy. In my opinion, it's a very poor book compared to the other two. A far better book than any neoclassical book, but don't read them in the reverse direction, which a lot of people do. They think the last book is going to be the best. I think that the middle was the best, and the first was the outstanding statement of the thesis, which was John Maynard Keynes. This is taken from Can It Happen Again? And he said the natural point to start analysing the relation between debt and income, and notice that's the first starting proposition, that relationship which neoclassical theory says doesn't exist, is his starting point. It's to take an economy with a cyclical past that is now doing well. And over the period that it does well, two things become evident. Existing debts are easy to pay, and units who are heavily in debt prosper. It pays to lever. So you get encouraged by a period of economic stability to go into more debt. And therefore, he said stable growth is inconsistent with the manner in which investment is financed in the debt-driven economies we live inside. And therefore, the fundamental instability of capitalism is not the downward instability you get from so many Marxist critics talking about the declining rate of profit and things like that. He's saying, no, it's an upwards instability, which is debt finance, and that just gives you the crashes when, of course, you can't finance that debt at a later stage. So the tendency to transform doing well into a speculative boom is the basic instability in a capitalist economy. Now, my contribution to this was to build a mathematical model of that, and the foundation was work by an economist that actually, pardon me, was at the same university as Minsky for a while, though they unfortunately didn't get on and didn't agree about the nature of capitalism either. On this one, I definitely think Minsky was right and Richard Goodman was wrong. But Goodman built a simple cyclical model of the economy. And the basic proceeding is quite simple. Capital determines output. This is a deterministic model. There's no stochastic elements to it. Pardon me. Capital determines output. Output determines employment. Employment determines the rate of change of wages, and that's very important. That's a dynamic relationship. Wages determine profits, profits determine investment, and investment is the rate of change of capital, the second dynamic relationship. And that gives you a model of cyclical growth. So I've done a simple version here without growth built into it. I've just simply got a cycle going on there. But I'll bring that up if I can find the right one. Okay, well, that's the model there. And if I simulate it, what you get is cycles in wages and employment driven, of course, from cycles in GDP. So those cycles will go on indefinitely. I'll slow it down a bit so you can see it rather more easily. So you get a up and down in employment and wages share. There's no time lag difference involved here. This is an out-of-phase dynamic coming out of the system. It's not a case of time lags, which a lot of economists think you need to get results like that. But those cycles will go on indefinitely. But there's no monetary system inside there. So what I did was add two elements of realism. And the first is that, or three, the way I've stated it here, investment exceeds profits during a boom, it's less than profits during a slump, and the difference is financed by the change in debt. And ironically, I found a strong empirical paper supporting that by, of all people, Fama in French. So it's an argument you can find empirically in the literature. And endogenous money is essential here, of course, because that's where the extra spending power comes from. It's not a sacrifice in one group, it's an addition to spending power. Now, what that gives me, and I'll show you in a moment what it looks like, is the regular cycles disappear. You get complex behavior coming out of it. You can have this convergence to an equilibrium, or a good equilibrium, or you can have a collapse to a bad one. So stability leading to instability. There's a rising level of debt to GDP when you have instability. And what actually happens, and this was totally unexpected by me, it's not part of Minsky's verbal theory either, it was the property of the model. And that was that there was a period of apparently increasing stability. There was declining volatility in employment and inflation, in this case, the proxy for inflation being the workers' share of output, and then a breakdown. And there's also rising inequality. Workers' share is negatively related to the level of debt, even though workers aren't borrowing in this model. So that was a very strange set of outcomes for me. I'll just show you the dynamics. So remember the one I showed you a moment ago. Let's bring up the simulation here. So I've added nonlinear relationships, growth, and the finance sector, which basically the finance is the difference between what capitalists wish to invest and what they actually invest. And I simulate this model, and what you get are these cycles where employment, notice these cycles getting much diminishing, a great moderation. Notice the declining workers' share. which translates as lower inflation in the same way it would in a neoclassical model. Notice over here the rising debt level. This gets all sorts of different shapes depending upon the functional form I used. Now notice you can see that the cycles are getting larger. This model doesn't have deflation, by the way, so I can't show a price effect. When I bring that in, it's all on the downside. These cycles don't have the huge booms, just the slump I'm showing you. But ultimately, this system leads to a total breakdown. If I let it run for long enough, you'll see the debt ratio starting to go up and down in a series of booms and busts. We're getting higher each time, cycles getting more extreme, and ultimately the economy reaches zero employment, zero workers' share, and an infinite debt to GDP ratio. Now that's where we would have got if it hadn't been for the bank rescues, writing off of debt, and the enormous injection of government money during the financial crisis we've been through. So it's not a vision of a stable system, but it might be a more realistic vision than the one we get in conventional economic theory. So when I built that model, I distinctly remember writing this particular paragraph in 1992. It took 3 years before it turned up in the academic paper, but I said we have to go beyond Keynes, what Keynes argued. We rely too much upon the stable past as a guide to the future. And I said the chaotic dynamics, this was a rhetorical flourish I thought at the end of the paper when I wrote it. The chaotic dynamics thought in this paper should warn us against accepting a period of relative tranquility in the capitalist economy as anything other than a lull before the storm. Well, after 1992, that lull appeared, and neoclassical economists titled it the Great Moderation. There was, empirically, a clear decline in the levels and the volatility of unemployment and inflation. And looking at that, the neoclassical action was, we've solved the problem. We've got rid of the trade cycle. And the level of triumphalism amongst neoclassicals at the time reminds me of the Fukushima quote phrased at the end of history. Here's Lucas in December 2003, his presidential address, saying that macroeconomics was born as a distinct field in the 1940s. It's nice after Keynes had disappeared from the scene, relatively, as part of the response to the Great Depression. He said, and we'd hoped it would prevent an occurrence of that disaster. And he said, my thesis is we have succeeded. The central problem of depression prevention has been solved for all practical purposes and has been for many decades. Bernake in 2004, talking about the so-called Great Moderation, said that the low inflation era of the past 2 decades has seen significant improvements in growth and productivity, less volatility, etc., etc. Recessions are less frequent and milder. He said the sources of this Great Moderation are controversial, or even more so now, of course. But he said there's argument that the improved control of inflation is what's contributed to this. So again, neoclassical economists patting themselves on the back slightly before the economy stabbed them in the back. The OECD in June 2007 is my favourite. And I really think this is I often read these documents as an academic, but imagine being a politician, reading this as a reassuring guide. The future is going to be really calm and relaxing. Go and arrange those holidays you want to have with people you don't want to know you visit. Relax. It's going to be a great time to be a political leader. This is the OECD in June of 2007. So the US slowdown, which was becoming apparent then, wasn't going to lead to a period of weakness, rather to be a smooth rebalancing. I love this in this particular room, with Europe taking over the baton from the United States and driving OECD growth. And they said, the current economic situation is in many ways better than we've experienced in years. And said, our central forecast is quite benign, a soft landing in the United States. I'm flying there tomorrow. I hope I don't have a soft landing like that. Strong and sustained recovery in Europe, solid trajectory in Japan, sustained growth underpinned by strong job creation and falling unemployment. June 2007. 2 months later, the crisis began. Now, the factor which is going on in the background that's going to be ignored by neoclassicals is apparent when you look at it. Any medical person looking at that, not even knowing what it was, will say something might be going wrong there. Okay? Exponential growth of something. That's the ratio of debt to GDP from 1980 forward. And of course, what happened was the rate of growth of the economy came to an end when the rate of growth of debt collapsed. And I'm going to get slightly controversial here, views that I know some of our post-Keynesians don't agree with me on as yet. I'll see if I can win the argument over time. But the crisis began when the rate of growth of private debt collapsed. That dotted line there is August 2007. And you can see the blue line is the rate of change of private debt. measured on the right-hand scale of the graph. And the dotted line across the horizontally across there is when the rate of change of debt is negative. And I didn't need to get anywhere near negative. As soon as it started to go down dramatically, and then ultimately hit negative, that's when the downturn began. And what you had was an unemployment and inflation, which had been doing such nice things beforehand. Suddenly unemployment explodes and inflation becomes deflation. Quite substantial. People don't realize there was a period where the American CPI was falling at 2% per annum. Okay. Now, the scale of government spending, the rescues that went in there, stopped that continuing. But you can still see we're heading back down towards in that direction again. Deflation has become the norm, even with the scale of the government rescue. Now, this is where I'm getting controversial. I argue that you can show a relationship between the change in debt and the level of economic activity and the acceleration of debt and the change in economic activity. So these are propositions I haven't established to the satisfaction of my colleagues yet, but I think the data is fairly strong. I'll just stick with the data here rather than going through an academic argument. But the correlation there of the change in private debt as a percentage of GDP to the level of unemployment over 25 years from 1990 is minus 0.9. It's a single factor. Most economists are happy to get a 0.4 or 0.5 magnitude R squared. That's a 0.8. Looking at the change in debt, the change in employment and the acceleration of private debt, again the same time period, that correlation, then you can see the savagery with which the crisis hit. That debt acceleration is normally slightly above zero, as you can see across this period. Of course, acceleration below zero doesn't mean you're not rising, you're rising more slowly. Then this huge drop and a massive negative acceleration, okay? You hit the brakes really, really hard, then back up again. Correlation there, minus 0.89. And it affects asset markets as well. So this is the level of house prices and the change in mortgage debt. Correlation there, 0.61. Again, there's a positive correlation because I'm talking about rising debt causing rising asset prices. And the acceleration correlation here is about, I think, 0.8 or 0.9 again. That's the correlation of the change in house prices to the acceleration of mortgage debt. Correlation 0.79. So very strong, forget about the theory at the moment, very strong empirical arguments to say that in the real world, whatever might be the causal mechanism we're looking at here, change in debt drives economic activity, change in debt drives the change in economic activity. And that has a profound irony for law here, because if you think about the focus of courts on what they should do about contract, it's about enforcing contracts. It's making sure contracts are actually met by both parties. You very, very rarely have a law court that considers happily the idea of revising a contract. It's entered into freely by parties, it should be enforced. It's the law's role to enforce it. And of course, most credit contracts are going to involve the debtor defaulting or not servicing the debt as required. And the fault presumption in that case falls on the debtor. You agreed to pay this money back, you can't pay it back, it's your fault, what have you done wrong, what remedies can we impose to the benefit of the creditor in this situation. Now, if you're talking about a default during a stable period of economic performance, not before the euphoric economy or stable to euphoric level, then it's fairly easy to say who's to blame, relatively speaking. You might find normally the debtor will be at fault. But if you have a systemic crisis, then the failure of existing borrowers can be caused by the later decisions of other parties either to take on less debt or to repay existing debt or to go bankrupt. So what actually causes somebody to fail can be the actions of other people subsequent to their actions. And then, again, the causal loop is quite complicated. The fact that people took out debt at one point is what caused the booming circumstances that encourage others to go into debt later. It is not easy to drag out of that a simple proposition that the debtor is at fault. And of course, the lenders can be at fault because they are driving the excessive creation of debt. The only people who, at first order principle, definitely profit from rising levels of debt are bankers, quite personally in many, many cases. So it is wrong to say that the debtor is at fault automatically and not fulfilling a debt contract. You have to find a way around that presumption to get the law to properly do what the law is supposed to do, which is to enforce a good civil society. And Minsky talked about enforcing a good financial society, where the tendency to finance excessive risk-taking and bubbles is constrained. the legal system needs to have that same mindset as well. And of course, when you try to apply the current system, you're going to get overwhelmed. I don't know the actual numbers on how many mortgages were renegotiated by the proceedings Obama put into place in America, but I'm sure it's only about 1 in 10 of the contracts that could have been reset in some sense. So the legal system is overwhelmed by these systemic crises, and I don't think that you can actually bring about a case-by-case approach which would ever have the capacity to cope with what happens when a systemic crisis hits, and another one will hit. And this is to give you a bit of a long-term perspective. Again, when people talk about debt, or normally they don't talk about private debt, they leave it out of their mindset completely. Well, they often don't look back particularly far either, and they don't really have a point of view of where we stand in human history on this front. This is the best I've been able to assemble on the ratio of private and public debt to GDP for the last 180 years. The red line being private debt. I think that makes my case about, well, there's a trend there, which is something to be very concerned about. Collapses during systemic crisis, of course, the biggest collapse being the Great Depression. But we're now back into a stage of re-leveraging in America again. People think there's been deleveraging. That's the scale of the deleveraging. Now compare that to the deleveraging that occurred during the Great Depression and the Second World War. It's trivial. It's even trivial compared to what happened back in the Civil War. So the level of debt we've got now has only been slightly reduced, and the boom that is gathering some momentum in America now, though very fragile momentum, is being started from a level of debt that has never been that has never been the starting point for a boom beforehand. If I go back to 1990, the starting level of debt then is about 100% of GDP. You're now trying to have a revival from 160%. That's a very good empirically oriented book I do recommend people to read by a man whose name is strange, and I'll talk about who he was first of all before I mention his name. He was the person who introduced America's two most successful credit card companies. He won't tell me what he's worth. He's something in the billionaire range. And the book is called The Coming Economic Crisis and What to Do About It. Richard Vague is his name. And Richard has done anything but vague, a very precise analysis looking at about 30 or 40 financial crises around the world over the last century, and said the empirical guide that he's got out of what causes a crisis and when does it happen is that when the level of private debt to GDP exceeds 150%, and when that ratio grows by 18% or more over a 5-year period, meaning say from 150% to 168%. So any country which hits that 150% or above level and has the debt level rise by 18% or more, with only 2 exceptions, has had a financial crisis. Those 2 exceptions, by the way, are my country, Australia, in the most recent experience, and South Korea, because both our countries were selling into the Chinese boom. That managed to give us so much cash coming in, it overwhelmed the negative impact of our own financial crises back at home. But those 2 exceptions, that set of numbers, 150% or more, and an 18% rise over 5 years, and you have a financial crisis. Now, America already qualifies. Okay, it's had 1 crisis already. It's starting the next boom from a level beyond the point at which Richard said a crisis will happen if that debt ratio rises 18%. If it does that, it's just getting back to where it got to back in 2009. So it's not a lot of momentum needed to get us back in another crisis again. So Minsky's classic phrase was, can it happen again? And I think the answer is yes, it will, and it'll happen sooner than last time. If you time how long it took from the last crisis to into the last recession to the one we've been through just recently, 1992 to 2007, about 15 years. I can see it being half that or less before we're back in another financial crisis again. Though unfortunately, probably thinking we've learned something about it, which I don't think we have as yet. So in conclusion, summing up, teaching loans as similar to commodity transfers is misplaced. But our legal treatment of loans is based on that analogy. We have to amend that. And the systemic nature of crises and the role that debt plays in causing both the booms and the slumps and then the bankruptcies means that this case-based focus and looking just at the immediate parties to a case is also wrong. So you need to have the capacity somehow to modify contracts after the event. Debt write-downs have to be accepted as part of the legal system. However we do that's another story. And we need a systemic rather than a case-based approach. And that means, therefore, if we're going to have a realistic provision of money, which we're trying to provide, we need a realistic provision of the law as well. And then finally, I'll do a bit of advertising. You may know I'm at Kingston University now. I'm I'm now saying if anybody finds their economics not to their liking where they are, come to Kingston. Thank you.